Catherine Parr escaped the executioner's block and outlived England's most dangerous king. But her story did not end in peace. Long after her final breath, her body was violated, exposed, and turned into a macabre curiosity. While other queens were laid to rest with honour, Catherine's afterlife became a nightmare. On a rain-soaked morning in July 1543, Catherine Parr married Henry VIII at Hampton Court Palace. By this point in his reign, Henry VIII was a man feared as much as he was obeyed. Once athletic and charismatic, the king was now obese, chronically ill and in constant pain, suffering from infected leg ulcers that often left him irritable and volatile. His temper was legendary, his paranoia deepened by years of rebellion, betrayal and religious upheaval. 2 wives had been executed, 2 discarded, and 1 had died in childbirth. The Tudor court understood a brutal truth. Marrying Henry VIII was one of the most dangerous positions a woman could occupy in Europe. Catherine Parr knew this better than anyone. At 31, Catherine was older than Henry's previous brides and far more experienced. She was twice widowed, politically seasoned, and intellectually confident. She was also in love with Thomas Seymour, not the king. Yet Henry's interest was not something one could decline. In Tudor England, a king's proposal was not a request. Refusal could be interpreted as disobedience, or worse, treason. Catherine accepted, fully aware that this marriage might cost her freedom, her beliefs, or her life. Unlike earlier queens, Catherine was not chosen for fertility or beauty alone. Henry sought stability. He needed a woman who could manage his household, care for him physically, and bring calm to a court exhausted by scandal. Catherine, with her patience, maturity and intelligence, seemed ideally suited, but suitability did not mean safety. From the beginning, Catherine's marriage was defined by caregiving and caution. She became Henry's nurse as much as his wife, overseeing his treatments, soothing his pain, and adapting herself to his unpredictable moods. The king could be generous and affectionate one moment, cruel and suspicious the next. Catherine learned to read the king's silences, to speak carefully and to retreat when necessary. Survival depended on emotional intelligence as much as loyalty, yet she was no passive consort. Catherine quietly redefined what it meant to be queen consort. Rather than focusing solely on ceremony, she took an active role in governance, education, and religion. She restored harmony within the royal family, something none of her predecessors had fully achieved. Through diplomacy and persistence, she helped reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, bringing them back into court and ensuring they received a rigorous education. Catherine also supervised the royal household with remarkable efficiency, earning the respect of courtiers and councillors alike. Her competence strengthened Henry's trust in her, trust that would soon place her in an unprecedented position of power. In 1544, Henry embarked on a military campaign in France. Before leaving, he did something extraordinary. He named Catherine Queen Regent, granting her authority to rule England in his absence. Catherine presided over the council, signed royal proclamations, managed finances, and ensured military supplies reached the front. She demonstrated decisiveness and political skill, proving she was capable of ruling a kingdom during wartime. Her success as regent marked her as one of the most powerful queens consort England had ever known. But it also made her enemies. Catherine was deeply religious and increasingly aligned with Protestant reformist ideas. She believed in scripture in English, personal devotion, and education for women. She gathered scholars and reformers around her and became a patron of religious learning. In 1545, Catherine made history by becoming the first English queen to publish a book under her own name. Her work, Prayers or Meditations, was widely read and reflected her personal devotion. Later, she published The Lamentation of a Sinner, a bold Protestant text emphasizing salvation through faith. These beliefs were dangerous in a court still deeply divided between Catholic conservatives and reformers. She held theological discussions with Henry himself, bold conversations that sometimes crossed the line between intellectual exchange and perceived challenge. In Henry's court, being right could be fatal, especially for a woman. Conservative courtiers began to whisper that Catherine was a heretic, that she sought to influence the king's religious policy, that she was stepping beyond her role as wife. By 1546, their plotting reached its peak. A formal arrest warrant was prepared for Catherine, signed by the king himself during one of his darker moods. The charges, heresy and disobedience. The fate awaiting her was clear. She had seen it before. When Catherine learned of the warrant, she did not panic. Instead, she executed one of the most remarkable acts of political survival in Tudor history. She went directly to Henry. In a carefully staged conversation, Catherine humbly recanted any appearance of authority. She claimed that her theological debates were not meant to instruct or challenge him, but merely to divert his mind from pain and illness. She praised his wisdom, portrayed herself as a student rather than a teacher, and reinforced his supremacy. Henry, flattered and reassured, softened. The warrant was quietly withdrawn. When guards later arrived to arrest her, Henry angrily dismissed them, having already forgiven his queen. Catherine Parr had talked her way back from the edge of execution. The king finally succumbed to his many illnesses in January 1547. At just 35 years old, Catherine Parr became Dowager Queen, a status that conferred wealth, independence, and a respected position at court. Long before she became queen, Catherine had been involved in a complex and secret romance with the ambitious Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. Although she married Henry out of duty, her feelings for Thomas never entirely faded. Within months of the king's death, Catherine and Seymour rekindled their relationship. Their decision to marry, however, proved deeply controversial. The union was conducted in secret, likely in the spring of 1547, less than a year after Henry's death. To many at court, the match was scandalous, even improper. A former queen was expected to remain above such personal entanglements, particularly so soon after the loss of a reigning monarch. Nevertheless, Catherine became pregnant for the first time during this marriage. The pregnancy was arduous and debilitating, and it was during this period that Thomas Seymour's wandering eye turned toward Henry's youngest daughter, Elizabeth, then known as the Lady Elizabeth. As Catherine was widely considered dangerously old to be bearing children, Seymour may have been hedging his ambitions by directing his attention to the teenage princess, calculating that, should his wife die in childbirth, Elizabeth might yet become his bride. Seymour was openly seen in Elizabeth's chambers before she had risen for the day, dressed only in her nightgown, and was observed holding her in his arms while his wife was heavily pregnant. Meanwhile, Catherine, racked with illness and confined to her apartments, endured her final months as her husband continued to pay court to her stepdaughter. At the close of a scorching English summer, on the 30th of August 1548, Catherine Parr went into labour at Sudeley Castle. She delivered a daughter, Mary Seymour, who may have been named in a conciliatory gesture toward Mary I, in the hope of mollifying the Lady Mary's resentment toward Catherine for having, as she saw it, shamed her late father. Though Catherine appeared outwardly cheerful following the birth, she privately confessed grave forebodings, admitting that she feared such things in herself that she was certain she would not survive. Only days later, Catherine's fatal premonitions were realised. She became suddenly feverish, displaying the telltale signs of puerperal fever. In her ensuing delirium, her long-suppressed resentment toward Thomas Seymour rose sharply to the surface. "I am not well handled," she cried, accusing him of indifference and lamenting that he careth not for her but stood laughing at my grief. Seymour's attempts to soothe her proved futile. The more he sought to placate her, the more sharply and vehemently she rebuked him. The former queen died in the early hours of the 5th of September, afflicted by profound physical suffering and emotional distress. Catherine was buried later that same day in a chapel within the grounds of Sudeley Castle, with striking and unseemly haste, denied the time-honoured funerary rites befitting a woman who had once been Queen of England. Catherine was not accorded a funeral effigy, nor a procession of mourners, nor did she lie in state surrounded by thousands of wax candles, as her predecessors Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour had done. Her only surviving legacy, her infant daughter Mary Seymour, was placed in the care of a noblewoman, and in all likelihood died in early childhood. Catherine's death would appear to mark the end of a fascinating woman and of an equally thrilling tale, marked by royal intrigue, romance, and political gambits. And yet her story was determined not to end here. In fact, the Queen's body would undergo a dramatic expedition for another 300 years, resulting in one of the most chilling afterlives of any Queen consort in British history. On the day of her death, Catherine's body was hastily sheathed in waxed cloth and wrapped tightly with sheets of lead, impenetrable to the various elements of the idyllic Cotswolds. After a short, albeit solemn prayer was delivered over the body, Catherine's body was interred and forgotten for centuries. The Queen's burial site would eventually fall into ruin. The chapel's roof was at one point removed, and by the mid-18th century nature's rot had set in. In 1782, however, a local resident named John Lucas would stumble upon Catherine's coffin, found buried at a depth of 2 feet. He pried open the Queen's tomb, made a small, curious incision in the body's waxed cloth wrapping, and miraculously found Catherine's flesh still white and moist, and strikingly lifelike. Lucas described her appearance as unchanged, another tremendous feat, considering that Catherine had died over 2 centuries prior. He snipped a few pieces of Catherine's hair, a swatch of fabric from her gown, and snagged a tooth from the Queen, which is now located alongside various other relics in the Sudeley Museum. Lucas, having concluded his poking around of the site, left Catherine to rest in peace once more. Nevertheless, his discoveries would have dire consequences for the late Queen. They soon attracted a cult of well-bred ladies to flock to the tomb of Henry VIII's final wife, marvelling at the Queen whose physical form, both in life and in death, was viewed as a tangible, powerful and sacred extension of the body politic. Only a year later, in the summer of 1783, explorers returned to the site of Catherine's burial. On being told what had been done the year before by Lucas, one witness wrote, "I directed the earth to be once more removed to satisfy my own curiosity." The only difference that this witness discovered was that Catherine's body had begun to emit a fetid odour, and the flesh where Lucas had made an incision was brown in a state of putrefaction, in consequence of the air having been let in. Deterred by the stench of the corpse, the witness concluded his excavations and decided that a stone slab should be placed over the grave to prevent any future and improper inspection. Catherine's coffin would be again reopened in 1784 by some rude persons, who collected the body and left it exposed on a heap of rubbish until the parish vicar procured its reinterment. Again in 1786, Reverend Nash made a scientific exhumation of the body and described Catherine's face as totally decayed, the teeth sound but had fallen out, and the hands and nails were entire but of a brownish hue. The Reverend wrote that he wished that more respect were paid to the remains of the Queen, hoping that she would someday be decently buried so that her body could at last rest in peace. Instead, the dilapidated chapel where Catherine had been buried had been misappropriated into a shed for rabbits, which make holes and scratch very irreverently about her royal remains. Throughout the final decades of the 18th century, Catherine's coffin would be opened several more times. In the 1790s, a pair of drunken gravediggers attempted to satisfy the Reverend's desire by gouging out a new grave for Catherine, though they later buried her upside down. Strickland claims that the gravediggers abused the corpse, though she is vague on the issue to describe what they actually did to Catherine's body was too horrific to mention. Certain sources suggest that the bacchanalian pair pulled out Catherine's hair, knocked out several of her teeth, wrenched off her arms, stabbed her through the chest with an iron bar, and pilfered the Queen's body parts to sell as souvenirs. In any event, Catherine's remains had become a commodity, a vestige of the glories and barbarity of the Tudor age. 2 decades later, in 1817, Catherine's tomb would be disturbed and disinterred for a final time. The rector of Sudeley had resolved himself to launch repairs of the chapel, determined to find the place where the pie-eyed gravediggers had ignominiously dumped her body. After considerable search, the explorers found Catherine bottom upwards in a walled grave and then moved her to a separate vault. To the great disappointment of all, the witnesses found nothing but the skeletal remains of the Queen, together with a few shreds of cloth and a small quantity of dark-coloured hair. At last, Catherine's perfectly preserved body had succumbed to nature's withering course. It is reported that an ivy wreath had wound itself about Catherine's head, forming a green sepulchral coronet over the Queen's skull. The magic of Catherine's body dissipated with the advent of the 19th century. In 1861, the remains of Queen Catherine were collected and interred with pious care elsewhere. By then, however, her skeleton had been reduced to a little brown dust. Her fragmented remains were finally placed in St Mary's Church at Sudeley Castle, in what is now the finest coffin of any of Henry's wives. To this day, Catherine lies peacefully within a neo-Gothic tomb, her marble hands clasped in reverent and at last eternal prayer. Sudeley Castle, where Catherine's body has rested since her death some 470 years ago, remains home to rare copies of books owned and written by the Queen, as well as her love letters made out to Thomas Seymour and eyewitness accounts of the discovery of her burial site. The jewels and magnificent gowns Catherine once wore as Queen were confiscated by the Crown and sent to the Tower of London after Seymour's execution in 1549.